So today what we're going to be covering is just a really simple notes app, but I thought what I'd do is we can go from a one file notes app, just using the most basic Redux that we've already seen. Then to that, we'll add things like dispatch, provider, selector. Those are things we add to actually make it use many files. Like if we want to take bits of code out, make components out of that. That's sort of what we do. And then after that, actually, there's a slight change I'll introduce. So after that, what we're going to do is, let's say like our state is more complicated. We don't just have one thing. What if our state is an object that has more than one thing? So we're going to think about how to do that. And the actual approach is having multiple reducers. And that will segue really nicely into the afternoon lecture where we talk about Redux Toolkit, which is actually, that's sort of the better way of using Redux is Redux Toolkit. But this lecture will sort of help us transition into that. So let me share my screen. And I've already have here a little like notes app. So I think what I can do is maybe first let us just describe what we see here. Oops. I prefer having this on. Okay. This here. And then having this that side. Okay. So everyone can see my screen. What we have here basically is, so this is our really simple notes app. Now, all of this is just in one component, in one sort of file. And so right here, we're just using the same old method that we introduced quite a while ago. We have an initial state. So this is from top to bottom. I'll describe what's happening and why we can write everything in one file like this and why we can get that to run. So here I'm just creating an array of objects, and a note is represented by an object like this. So this is an object, curly braces. I have three key value pairs. I have ID, which is going to be a number. I have content, a string, and I have important, a Boolean. Okay, so there's that. And then I have a reducer. I've just defined this right here. So what this note reducer is doing is it takes in, so notice that it says state equals initial state, or sorry, initial notes, which is just this. So what this reducer is doing is it's just setting the state in the store to just be these three notes. That's just right in the beginning. And so my reducer takes in the state, which is initially going to be initial notes, but then after that, it'll be whatever it was from before. And then I have an action. So we have a few types of action. So these are like action. This is referring to when we dispatch actions to our store. So that's when the user does something. We need to say the action has to have a type and a payload. And so in this case, our type, if it's create, here we're just going to be creating a new note and we're adding it to our state. Now here I grab the note inside the payload. Payload's an object. So I think actually here, yeah, and then I update that. Now I'll go more into this when we get to that part. But so this is a bit about initializing a store. So this is the actual core functionality we looked at a while ago. I have to actually create a little variable called store, and I have to say create store, and I have to pass in the reducer into that. Now, that's actually a pretty common theme we'll see as the changes are made as well. This is my app component. Now notice in the same file app, that's all the app down here. In the same file here, I just, right after that, I've defined that. I basically have my root. I create the root, and I make a function called render app. And then inside of that, I say root.render app. So every time this function's called, I am rendering the root again, basically. And so that's why I have to call it at least once here to actually do the first render. And then when I do this store.subscribe, what this means is that anytime a change is detected in the store, usually caused by actions, so whenever the state of those notes changes in any way, like I've added a note or I've changed the importance of a note, I'm calling this function is called here, which is really just rendering the app again. And so that's how we connect the two. And okay, so let me just run this and we'll see it on the side. Hopefully once this loads, because then I want to show some console logs on the side of how this is working. Okay, perfect. So here we have, so we first, okay. So this is just some, this is just the initialization it looks like from line 18. So that is this console. So this is the initialization. This is the first time this runs. So you don't need to write Redux inside of index.js. I'm just starting at a point where everything is in one file, just to make things more clear in terms of who's calling who and like how this thing is working, how these moving parts are working in Redux. But once this is explained, then I will move to using provider, dispatch, and selector so we can have separate files, because ideally we probably want to separate these into components where these are our notes is one component, another component is adding the note, right? So these are things that we probably want to do. But initially we'll just start at a point where we only have one file. And so this is the most basic implementation of Redux, is just having one file this way. So yes, that in this format, it has to be in the same file like this. So let's run through the logic of what happens to even get like this here. So this thing, store.getState, that gets my list of nodes, okay? Now, let's handle click importance first, so then I'll talk about this. So this map, what this map is doing is it's taking a node, which at this point is just an object, and it is returning basically. So this returns another list, but the only difference is that instead of having objects in this list, which is what we start as with just the nodes themselves, right? Given how we've defined them up here, instead of having objects in this list, we're going to return a list of basically HTML elements that are all list items, right? So notice that for the key, I'm using node.id, and we have key because we want to be able to distinguish one from another in our in our document object model. We want in this DOM here, we want these list items to actually have keys, just so it can more easily distinguish between one and the next. This is important for when React is deciding, when it's doing its diffing and it's deciding, okay, like what is the minimum number of changes we need to make to update how this looks at. Exactly, yeah. Key is predefined. So if I think if maybe, yeah, key is like, there are many attributes on these elements, and key is just one that's predefined. Even the UL has a key, even this div, I think, has a key. Yeah, exactly. They all have these. It's just up to us to set it when it's relevant. So in this list item, I just have note.content. Again, I'm using curly braces because it is JavaScript that I'm grabbing and putting in there. And then I have this logic here. So what this logic means, so this is the bold part. It's strong just means make it bold text. And inside of this, I have more JavaScript logic. So this is a ternary operator, and I'm saying that if the note's important, note.important is Boolean. So it's either true or false. So it's kind of like saying if the note is important, then, so if note.important in the true case, put this like important text there. Otherwise, in the false case, don't put anything there. And so that's why, here I don't have any text. Here I have important in bold. So it's just that so I can see if the note's important or not. Then I have this button here, and this is an on-click handler. Sorry, this button here. And let's look at the on-click later. Let's first look at this bit. So this is pretty similar to what I had before. If the node is important, the button text, I want to say, make it unimportant, right? Because if clicking the important this button is, if it's important, it makes it unimportant. If it's not important, it makes it important. So there's some there's a difference in terms of what it's doing. Now it's changing the same thing, but it's just changing it differently. So if the note is important, then clicking the button makes it not important. So I should probably have that there. And if the note is not important, this is false, clicking the button should make it important. Exactly, it is a toggle. And I have a little, some logic to decide what text to show on the toggle, depending on what the context is. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far on anything that I have discussed? There might be other things here that I will discuss soon, just to explain this, but anything so far and anything that I have talked about. So far I've just talked about the render app, the initial setup of our store, and adding our reducer to the store. Store.getState, okay. So store.getState, this just grabs the state from the store, which is essentially this. It's an array of objects. And this state is set in the reducer, because notice that this is the initialized store on line 38. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying store equal create store, and then I'm passing the note reducer here, this reducer. And then in this reducer, I say state equal initial notes here. And notice I have a console log in my reducer. I'm console logging the action. And I actually get a console log right here. Type, so the type of this action, at like Redux /init. So this is the first initialization of, this is like the first time everything is called. Like naturally, when all of this is called, I'm actually like this line is being run here. And like all of this is being run for the first time. This is run, that renders it. And then this store.subscribe render app is called as well. So, and what all that does together is that, okay, it's like, okay, the first time I run this, I add the note reducer to the store, or rather I create the store with it. And then I set these initial notes to the state, which is why I actually see these here. It's also why I get this initialization action get printed here. Yeah. Okay, so I see another question. Great question. How to choose between these two options? So when it comes to choosing between these two options, it is actually probably better to do the second option, which I will show in a bit. But again, I'm just showing this just so it's more clear where we start from and just the Redux, just to go over that. But I will be, after this, we'll be doing a certain number of changes that will make it repeat the options again. Okay, so yeah, get state is separate. This is not set state. Get state is something, it's Redux specific. It just gets the state from my store. It's not, this is totally different from the React use state hook. Right, so the options, by options, I mean like different ways to initialize with Redux. So different ways to initialize with Redux. What I'm doing here in this file is, refresh that. What I'm doing in this file is basically I've put everything in one file, all my Redux, my app, everything. This is not ideal for larger applications, obviously, right? Because we want to use components, we want to do these sorts of things. So, so that's what I mean by option. This is one option, doing it this way. Now, this way is just for learning, just so we can see everything in one file. A better option is to what I'll be showing very shortly, which is we use dispatch, providers, selectors, and I'll be explaining what those actually are and like why we need to use those and how that's different from what we're doing here. Yeah. When I called the note reducer, I didn't pass an action to it. Exactly. So this is just the initialization action. This is always running first time. Yeah, let's go into actions. Okay. So here, notice that I have a button, important or unimportant. It's the same button, it's just the text inside of it changes depending on the situation. Now, check this out. We have an on-click handler. So when I click this button, I'm going to run this handle click important function. Now, what this function is going to do is it takes an event from here, and it takes the ID of the note. And let's look up here to see what this does. So here I prevent default, probably not necessary, but I just have it there out of habit. And then what I do is first I'm console logging, changing importance of note with ID. So that, just so I get a console log telling me the ID of the note that I've clicked. It's not really necessary, but it's just to have it there. And remember, these IDs, it's like 1, 2, 3, just to clarify. So when I click that, we'll see that. One more thing. This bit here. So this is actually how I send something to the reducer or to the store. I dispatch it. So when I say store.dispatch, I'm passing in an object. And there are 2 key value pairs in this object. I have the type, which is like it's kind of like I'm telling the reducer. So when I dispatch this, the reducer receives it. It receives these actions. It reduces them to modify the state. It's kind of in the name reducer. I receive all these actions that have been dispatched to me. I'm the reducer, and I'm going to reduce all of them down to just doing one thing, which is modifying that state. Right, so when a user clicks, not the sentence, the button, important or unimportant. So it will either change the note to important if it's not important, or to not important if it's important. So there's a bit of it. It's like a toggle that can do one thing or it can do another thing, but it's just changing the same thing. It's changing that important field in the note. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. So I'm going to dispatch to my reducer. The type is set importance. Notice it's not make it important or make it unimportant. It's just saying set the importance. So just change whatever it is. And the payload is another object ID. So notice that when I use this format, when I do this, basically what that's doing is it's just doing this, whatever the ID is. So if I pass in an ID of, let's say this was like 2, it would actually do something like that. So that is actually what this looks like. There's a key value pair. Sure, I can repeat the handle click important. So what handle click important is doing is it's just changing the importance of a note. It's changing this Boolean value here inside of a note. That's why I need to pass in the ID of the note I click, right? Because I need to know which note am I clicking, which note am I actually want to change the importance of. So to do that, I need to actually dispatch an action. I need to dispatch something to the reducer. I need to dispatch an action that the reducer receives. So the reducer can then perform that action. It can actually change the importance of that node. So in that reducer, in the action, I have two key value pairs. This is sort of generic. You have a type and a payload. The type is set in importance. The reason I have a type is so I can distinguish one action from another. Payload is just some extra data that's necessary for it to do the action, the update to the store. In this case, I need to send the ID, okay? And when I send this, if this ID is 2, really what happens is it looks like this. This is what the payload actually looks like if I do this format. It's another key value pair. All right. So let's see what happens when okay, so I do that there. Okay. Now, notice when I click, let's say that, notice that now it's not important anymore. Yes, we will show that. So notice that I get this console log, changing importance of note with an ID 2, right? Because this one, it's 1, 2, 3. So the second one has an ID of 2. And notice that I'm getting this console log, type set importance, payload. Okay, so let's open this console log. And so this is actually where we have defined set important. Notice it's in the reducer. So in this reducer, I'm console logging the action, which is why we see this object here. And this is the object that we've dispatched. The type is set importance. The payload is, see this ID2. So there's a key value pair. ID is the key, the value is 2. And right, so here I have a switch case. And what I'm doing here is I'm trying to handle these different actions. I remember earlier I said actions, we distinguish them based on the type. So we have a create case, we'll go over that later. We have this case here, set importance. So when I send this action in, when I dispatch it, it is caught in this case, basically. Now what this does, important ID, is I'm grabbing the ID from the payload. That's what this action.payload.id is. And then this, I return the new state. So I return a new. So set importance is a string. Yeah, so the type of set importance is a string. It's not predefined, so I basically say that, okay, that's the type I want to call this action. I could make this X, and then as long as that's X here, then I know it's being handled properly. So this bit here, this is actually really important because this is like using map to update this. But generally, in each case, what I want to return is the new state once it's been updated, okay? So what I'm returning here is a map function. Now, a map function, when called on any array, the state is an array of objects. So when called on an array, it returns a new array depending on what we do in the callback. So the idea here is that this callback function is basically going to run on each element in that array that we return. Now, what this callback is doing is it's saying, okay, take a note, and for each note, I want to return this. Now, what is this doing? So this is some logic here, and what this is doing, this bit is a ternary operator. This is checking. This is saying, okay, does note.id equal important ID? So does the ID of the note we're currently looking at, does it equal the ID that we passed in our payload? Remember, when I click important or unimportant here, in my payload, I pass in the ID of the note that I want to set to important or unimportant. Basically, the ID of the note I want to change. So here, when I map over this, I'm saying, okay, if the note ID equals the ID of the note I want to change, if that's true, return here. So this is returning a new note. And it's saying this dot 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 note is just saying that our note is initially an object. Dot 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 note, I'm going to destructure that object. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put all the other key value pairs in this new object, from notes in this new object. But then after, I'm going to say, wait, no. I want to change important. I want important to be the opposite of what it was before, because that's what the toggle is doing. It's just changing important to the opposite of what it was before. So that's why I say important, not note.important. So that's just the toggle. It's just changing the Boolean value, swapping it. And that's the true case. In the false case, where it's some other ID, I just return the note itself without any changes. So this is how I'm controlling updating these. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? So this important ID is just a I'm using it as a variable, right? So this is just a variable. And actually, I think this is a good question to ask though. What is the data type of action.payload.id? Remember this ID here, and then notice, what am I doing in my dispatch here? Right. So it's a number. More specifically, it's going to be this number, whichever, it's the number of the ID that I click. So if I click this third one, it's going to be 3, the number 3. It's basically the number of the ID that I want to change the importance of. I see. Okay, so it's different from this ID because this map function calls this on each note. So it'll call it on the note with the ID of 1, with the ID of 2, and with the ID of 3. It's a callback. So it's this map is basically, it's like calling this on each and every note in my state. And that's why I need to have this check here to check, is the note that I'm currently running on, is it the same as the note that I want to change? And if it is, then I change it here. Otherwise, I don't change it. Okay, maybe let's do this. So it is a toggle, but it's more, I think the issues with the map. So no, important ID does not change. This is the same. This is always the same. So when I click some button here, important ID is always that. So here, I think this will help. I'm going to console log. So in my map function, because remember, the map is running, it'll be more clear now. The map is running, whatever is inside this is basically like this. This is a function. This whole thing is a function. There's no name to it. But this function, this whole thing that I've highlighted is running in the map on every node. And so now it'll be, with this console log, it'll be more clear. So if I do that, check that out. So now the first thing is before we dispatch, we say we want to change importance of note with ID 3. And then here I'm saying type set importance, okay? So that is this console log here, the action that I want to do. Now check, so this part's important. In my map, I'm console logging current node ID and the ID I want to change. And that's why I see when it runs on the first element of my notes, it's saying, or in my state, it's saying current node ID is 1. The ID we want to change is 3. And then the next time the current node ID is 2, we want to change 3. Current ID is 3, we want to change 3. So again, I'm console logging important ID. An important ID is always the same, it's 3. Because the one we want to change is always the same, in the time of like that time when we click S3, it's the same. So it's different because important ID is the one that we click. So when I click, notice, so if I click 3 here, notice that this note.id is changing. It's 1, 2, 3. Important ID is always 3. So if I click the last one, it's going to be 3. And then my note.id is either 1, 2, or 3, right? Because my note.id is something I'm grabbing when I map through. So basically this state.map, so this callback, I think this callback might be the thing, right? So when I am state.map is returning a new array of notes. Okay, so the logic is we have our state of notes. We want to return a new array of notes to update our state to, but we want the note that we have clicked to be different, to have its important field be swapped, right? So to do that, I have a map function. And the function that I'm passing into this map is this guy here. And what this is doing is it's just saying, it's just saying like this function is running on each node. And it's just saying that if the node's ID that I'm currently looking at is the same as the one I clicked, then change it. Otherwise, do not change it. So that is why important ID is different than ID. The ID is just a way for us to, we're using ID for us to be able to basically distinguish between notes. And when the notes that we clicked, that's the important ID, the notes ID that we clicked. And the ID itself is just something unique to every note. So that's why the logic, like, right? Like, is the note that I clicked, does its ID the same as the ID of the note that I'm currently looking at? And if it is, then change the importance. Yep, so there, and notice that in the button here on click, on every note, like this button is going to be put into every list item. And it's saying whatever it is, pass the note ID to this click function. And then when I dispatch it, I send the ID of whatever I click. So I can also click that. Now, technically, it's going to run for all of them, but it's only going to change this one here. All right. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break. I will keep this up here, maybe just here. I'll keep that up there, and then I'll be right back. And then I think once after 5 minutes, we're going to go over the next thing of creating notes, and then we're going to then do more changes. Alrighty, so we are back and I'm looking at some of the questions. Okay, so I see one question. Why didn't I use note/note instead of instead of just note inside return? Okay, so this thing here, why am I doing this? So what this is doing is basically, so this is actually what it's doing. I'm going to draw this out. So if note.id equals important ID, so if the note that I'm clicking, right, its ID equals the ID that in my map I'm looking at. So here we can see, let's say I click this note, this one here, right? So I would pass into my action. My action looks like this. I would say type set importance. I'll just put SI for short. And the payload would be another object, and it would be ID 3. Okay, if I click this one here. Now, when my reducer receives it here, I'm grabbing my important ID. I'm just going to put imp for short, IMP, important ID. That is going to be 3. I grab that from my payload. And then what I do here in my map function. So this map function is supposed to return a new array. And what's happening is that this from here to here is going to run on every element of that array. So basically it's like saying, let's say if I have an array A, B, C, okay? Now, if my map function was like return, so let's say this is array X, if I said x.map, I'll just put LM for short. If I were to say something like return LM plus 1, X does not change, but what I return from this call is a new array that is going to be A1, B1, C1, okay? The logic is the same. When I call this map, I'm returning a new array, but instead of having my note, I'm going to return this here, okay? Now, this is logic, but what actually I'm returning is I'm either returning this object, or in red, or I'm returning this object. Now, that's why I'm checking, does note.id equal important ID? My important ID, the one that I actually want to change, is 3. But because I'm calling this on every note, my note.id is different. It's 1, 2, or 3. I only want to change the third note. That's why I'm doing that check. If 1 does not equal 3, right? The first note is not the third note that I clicked, so I'm returning just the note itself. The second note does not equal the third note that I clicked, so I just return the note itself. Now, in the third case is this 3 equals 3. That's only happens once, okay? Then I return this object. Why? How is this different? So here, when I do ... note here, the note has 3 fields. It has ID, content, and important. When I do ... note, I'm basically taking that note, which is the third note, right? It's actually going to be this note, and I'm destructuring it. So I'm removing the brackets. That's kind of like me. I'm just doing this ... note is just writing this content, whatever the content is, and important was set to true. Okay. Now, when I do that, and then I do this important, whatever I write here replaces this important. Okay, this field, whatever I write here. So because it's the same key, it replaces the previous key, or it replaces any other key with the same name, because notes are like sets, or sorry, objects are like sets. We can only have uniquely named keys. And because I am reusing the same name of a previous key that exists in this note being important, it changes that. And I'm specifically setting it to not note.important. So this note.important is either true or false, but whatever it is, I want you to set the important to the opposite of what it is in my note. Because when I click this button, it's a toggle. I'm just toggling it to the opposite of what it currently is. Okay, so I hope that sort of that's just a recap on map function and this. But I do need to move on because there's quite a bit. The goal of this lecture was to show more complex state. Okay, so let's. Yeah, we do need to move to that one. Sure, let's leave that there. Okay. Yes, so creating a new node. Okay, okay, so this is the most important thing right now. So we discussed before, so there's something called a controlled form and an uncontrolled form. Okay, so there's two things. So, or controlled inputs and uncontrolled inputs. So what we have been working with in the past is controlled inputs. And you're probably familiar with this because you know that in a component, if this is my component, you might remember that I was discussing like this is like your input and this is set input, right? And you'd use a state to keep track of that. So here, if you have an input element somewhere, let's just say ... there's a bunch of stuff here. You have an input element here. Remember, you would do something like this. You would say value equals input, right? This is controlled because the value that is in this input is set from, is coming from the state. And so if I have some onChange handler, this onChange handler is setting whatever this is doing. It's actually going to be, usually I'll have another function like foo. Let's just put foo function. So I'll just call foo. But usually what foo is doing is it's going to say, okay, set input. I'm going to set the input to e.target.val. Okay, this is sort of what we've done so far, where we have these controlled inputs and the value that is written in this field, like if, let me change this to like yellow so you can see. The value that is written here, like if I type in E here, E changes up here. This becomes E. If I type in B here, this becomes B. Because onChange, I'm calling this function, which is updating my input. Let me actually bring up there's a pretty useful article on this. I think it has a really good visual that I can show. Let me try to find it. And I'll share it here as well. Controlled versus uncontrolled inputs. Oh, it's on my own. I have to go to this one. Okay. Here. All right, so let me clear the drawboard. And let's take a look here. And let me scroll down all the way here. So check it out. So this is we can ignore this. Let's just assume this is, anyway, the state is just going to be, this is the same as, well, this is a bit different, but this is a class constructor. Let's not worry too much about this, but let's just assume that I have a state and I have I have name and then set name, okay? And it's initially set to an empty string. So what I'm doing here, this is the same thing as saying set name to event.target.value, okay? And here the value, this is the same thing as just saying name. And so this is the idea of a controlled input or a controlled form. Every time I type a new character, my handler function onChange is called. It takes in the new value of the input and sets it in the state. So initially, let's say my state looks like this. If I type A, it then becomes A. If I type B, it becomes AB, right? And this, I think this is a good little diagram. I will share this. So that the most important takeaway is just that so far we've been doing that, okay? Here's something that we have changed. Now we're using a form. So this is what we're doing here. Now, what does this mean? So now I have a form and I have this button type equals submit. And I have an on submit handler. So this is the thing. This button is linked to this. So when I click submit here, the form submits. And notice that this event, this on submit event, is on the form itself. So the event target is the entire form. Now, why is this useful? Let's try one thing out. So I'm actually going to comment this out. I want to comment this out, all of this out for now. And I just want to console log e.target, just so we can see what that is. If I click submit here, notice the target is the form itself. And so that is, now that like the target has the form itself, I can then use that form to grab values in the fields, these input fields that exist inside of that form. Okay. That is the idea. So now it is uncontrolled. So controlled is when we like controlling the value of every single HTML element in our state. Now there's nothing in the state. It's just that when I click that, I can then grab values from the form. Okay. Here we can see this is the form. And check this out. This is the input, e.target.name. Now, why am I putting name here? Okay. So in the form here, I use name as another HTML element attribute. And I'm using name to grab, so I cannot write note. I have to write .name because this note, like, it's like this is an object and the key is name. And what that's going to give me is actually the input, this HTML element, this whole element it's going to give me. So if I save that, notice that I'm using here e.target.name to inside the whole form, I want to grab one particular input or one particular HTML element. And we distinguish these HTML elements based on their name attribute. So if now I click submit, notice that, well, this just says input. That's interesting. But here I will get the form. Now, yeah, this one is this input. So if I actually type something in, if I put test here, oh, it still just gives me that. Okay, sorry, one sec. So the more important thing though is to value e.target.name.value. Okay. Now, here's the more important thing. If I actually want to grab the value associated with this, then I have to do .name.value. If I wanted to grab test, let's just remove this. I want to grab test here. Oh, weird. That's undefined. I'm sorry, one sec. Oh, you're right. It is .note. My bad. That's why it was. Okay, so what happens if I do this? Yeah, you guys are right. So, yeah, because I set the name here to note, I do need to do .note. Grab that. My bad. And okay, so this is the input. That's why it was just giving input. And then let's try this. So the value is e.target.note.value. So just a clarification, here, if you want to, the name is the note, and we use the name to grab it. So to do that, we would actually need to do e.target.note. Yeah. Because the name is the note. All right. If I type in test and I submit, yeah, so now notice that I'm properly, so first I get the form from the target, then .note, I get that particular input where the name is note, and then .value, I get the value inside of this test. Okay. So here, now we can see, what are we doing here? My note is e.target.note.value, so I get the note. Exactly, yeah, that's the idea. That's the idea. When you use it like this, every element you want to give it a different name, so you can get the values of them. Like you can get the values inside of them just with this, just by changing this. So here I'm saying the content is note, and then I'm going to dispatch to the store, and I'm going to dispatch an action where the type is create. And the payload is the node itself. So if I'm just going to type in again, I'm going to say eating too many pineapples makes my tongue hurt. I think when I was a kid, I think I had too many pineapples and I could feel like my tongue, because it gives, I think they're like little sharp, I'm not sure why exactly. I think they're the fruit itself. There's like something in that actually gives you cuts on your tongue. So eating pineapple would make my tongue hurt, or too much pineapple. So I'm just going to add that as a note. And then if I click submit, now we can see that there. And it console logs. So content, this is eating too many pineapples makes my tongue hurt. And then here in the reducer, because the action being dispatched the reducer, it console logs the action. So the type is create, and then the payload is this note. It's an object which has a one key value pair, note, and then the content, eating too many pineapples makes my tongue hurt. And the type is create. So this action is caught in this case. And I'm basically saying, okay, I want to grab a new variable. I'm going to say the variable is action.payload.note. Now, this is not really necessary, but I just put that there. This new note is just going to be this string, eating too many pineapples, so on. What I'm returning is state.concat, and then I pass this object in. So what concat does, combines two or more arrays, returns a new array without modifying any existing. So what I can pass into this concat's a function. It returns a new array. Now, often we use it when we want to combine two arrays, but you can also just pass an item into into the concat as an argument. And what I'm passing is the new note, the new object. And in this object, the ID is going to be state.length +1. And that's because we want the ID to be just the next one. We want it to be 4. The length is 3, so just 3 + 1. Content is the string new note, and important by default. I have made it true. Right. So great question. Why don't we use push? And the reason why is because we need to use. There's something called like pure functions, or we cannot mutate the state. And so what that means is that we can't use push, we can't use we can't use anything that does not return a new array as a state. This is very like Redux and React specific. It's probably because we want, I think if we run the same action many times, we want the same output. So that's the idea with pure functions. And it's just sort of a convention that we don't want to use push, because push is just going to modify existing state. It's not going to return a new state. So that's the logic here. We want to return a new object that we set the state to. And internally, they're handling setting the state. And so that's what concat does. It returns a new array with that one extra item added to the end. Yeah, we cannot modify current state. So we can't use anything like push. We can't use append or splice or things like that. Actually, I'm not sure. I think splice might return a new array. I'm not sure about that. The difference between this and using a normal set state, right? So in this case, the difference here is that, and we'll see this more in when I make the changes, but the difference here is like this. This is my, oops, let's just erase that. Okay, so this is my React UI, right? This is just this is React, my React document object model. So these are my components, the parent, each child, and so on, right? That's just my application. The thing here is that if I don't use Redux, if I just have it like this, I might have all my state in this root component. And then everything here, if something like this needs to grab it from there, this needs to grab it from there. If something here modifies that, everything re-renders. So that's what happens with that. Now, here's the difference with Redux. It's less apparent in this example, but I will make when I make the changes to use dispatch and so on, it changes it. This is my Redux. The store is separate. Exactly. So if I just want, so that all my state might be here. And the thing is, if I have something here, I can just use a selector to grab it. And if an action here, I just use a dispatch to send it there. I do not end up re-rendering all of this. I only re-render the part that I want to re-render. And so that's the idea. If because the store is completely separate. Now, another benefit is that, you know, that when we use the React state, we started getting a lot of props that we just had to pass down everywhere. This, we can avoid these props because our state exists in a Redux store. We can access it from anywhere. We don't need to send so many props anymore. So that is another benefit. And in later lectures, we'll be going back over some of the applications we've already built, and we'll be modifying it to use Redux. So I believe tomorrow, later today, once we cover Redux Toolkit, tomorrow we'll be using Redux Toolkit, and we're probably gonna, you know, why not? Let's look at the puns, please, that thing, and let's try to like redo that in Redux. So we're gonna just be adding Redux and showing how we can reduce how many props we have, okay? All right, so let me clear that. Okay, let's continue. So now, yeah, so that's how I can cap that. Okay, so now we need to, right, there's one thing I'm missing here. That was missing. This here, if I click submit, I want to clear what's here. Yeah, all the, so that's the thing. So what will happen, oh, it's too bad I erased that. Maybe, oh, it's sweet, it still has it. So here's the thing. Oops. Okay. So if this guy here is grabbing something from here, this selector and a dispatch, grabbing that information, or actually, sorry, the dispatch is also, so dispatching an action, when I dispatch an action, I change the state. So if I have a selector here that grabs something from the state, the new state will actually also come in, and that will actually cause a re-render. So actually only this part will re-render, where I'm actually, or rather, the only parts that re-render are the places that have selectors that are grabbing the particular state that was changed. Okay, now what does that mean? So, okay, so let's say I have a state, I have fruit in this state as a field, okay? Let's say this modifies fruit. So this thing uses the fruit, and this thing uses fruit, but only those two things. So if anyone here, let's say this guy, dispatches an action that changes fruit from apple, let's say apple is changed to mango. Only this and this will be re-rendered because these are the only two that are actually using a selector to grab fruit. So only those ones will actually re-render. I do not believe, let's say, I don't think this will re-render because this is not actually using a selector to grab that particular, it doesn't actually need that state. It's only this guy that is using it. It would be a good test to do. Yeah, so it's only this guy that's needing it now. Yeah, I was thinking, oh, what if like I send this down to here, but then, I'm getting into props, and that would be a good test to do. If the fruit that I grab here, if I send it as a prop down to the child, I'm pretty sure then the child would re-render as well. So I hope that illustrates some of the difference between the Redux and the React. Let me just double check that. I can actually ask that. Let's ask ChatGPT. That is a question that, sure, let's just do it here. So if I am using a Redux selector to grab a particular state, let's say I dispatch an action that changes the state. Well, re-renders only occur in the particular components which are using a selector to grab the state that has been changed to change. Let's just confirm that. Yeah, so re-renders only occur in components that are connected to the part of the state that has been changed. So here they use connectors. We could also use selectors. What if I am passing that particular state I grabbed with a selector down as a prop to a child component? Would that child component also re-render? I'm thinking it would have to, because it is sort of connected. Interesting. It depends on how I implement it. That is interesting. Well, we can look more into that later, but exactly. We typically don't need props, or you could really minimize the number of props. Yeah, so we'll talk. Let's get into the selectors, providers, and all that. So let's get into that now. So we're going to get into changing these. So let's start changing this in a way so that to make our job easier of that transition. Okay, so let's first just, this is our starting point of changing. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make here a reducers folder. And in this, I'm going to make a note reducer. This is just going to make our life a bit easier when it comes to refactoring this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move this here, and I'm going to move this over here as well. And I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to create I'm going to actually create two actions here that can do this for us. So I'm going to say create note, and I'm going to take in action and find. Basically, the reason why I'm doing this, I'm just moving these here just to make it easier. So this is just going to be the same thing. Payload is, I have my action, and then I have, sorry. This should just be, I guess, my note content. Here I have note. Okay, right. So I'm just going to do that. This will be more clear very shortly. Okay. Do that for now. Now, when I change this, I'm going to do this export. Okay, well, let's move the other one too. So I'm not dispatching with store anymore. And this guy is also not there. And all of this is also not here as well. Now, this note reducer, I need to grab that reducer. Now, actually, that'll give me an error because I'm not exporting it from here. So let's toggle importance. Oh, let's make another one. Return type set importance payload. Okay. Let us create note toggle importance of note reducer. I'm just moving things to a different file here. Basically, our initial state, these are actions. So create notes, toggle. So these are just returning basically the action based on what I pass in. So basically here, what I would do is I would say import note reducer. So let's just see. Why is this giving me an issue? Import the note reducer. Can I import a bunch of things? Note reducer, create note, and toggle importance of. I name it differently here. No. I think I need to do it. Okay. So that is fine. I think I'm just importing it wrong here. Oh, what is going on? Okay. I had a, I think you can only default export one thing. So because I'm doing a bunch of things, I can't use that. Let's do that. And can I just have the actions as well? Create note, toggle importance of. Okay, so this changes slightly. What changes is basically here. I'm no longer going to be using the I'm going to be using dispatch. Now, if I want to do that, what I actually have to do now, something called use provider. So here, if I do this, so this changes things a little bit. My structure here is slightly different. So when I use a provider like that, I don't actually need this subscribe anymore. So this is how it would change. I'm going to remove this. I don't think I need any of that anymore. I can just do this. See here. Yeah. So once I have it set up, then I'll go through it. I probably should have had this done beforehand, but yeah, so I will subscriber provider, these things will be go over, but first thing I just want to get the render set up. Just trying to find a working example that I have from before. Okay, so this is a better example. So I create the root here, and what I'm going to do now is hopefully this dot, say create root, just trying to remember document dot. Okay, right. So now I'm just going to render it right away. So, and here I'm going to say provider, and I'm going to put my app inside of that provider. Now, this is what's different here. I'm wrapping my app with the provider, and then I'm actually giving the store here instead of saying store.subscribe. Now, hopefully, provider is not defined. Oh, not found in Redux. What? Oh, my bad. Okay. So provider is a separate package. So we would actually need to do, we need to install something called a React Redux. That's actually what gives us access to provider, selector, dispatch. So this will be explained very shortly. As soon as I install this, I'm going to say import provider from React Redux. Okay, so now I have my provider set up. Don't need just do so a few things have changed. What I first did was I actually just moved my reducers to a separate file here. And this will just make refactoring easier. And I'm exporting two actions. So these are actions, and I'm also exporting a note producer. So I can then use them here. Now, here's the more important thing. Yeah. So what provider does is provider, we wrap that around our entire app, and that's actually what gives us access to the store here. So this ensures that everything in our app, basically kind of like that diagram that I drew, has access to the store. This is also the first step of using dispatch and selector. Okay, so now things change slightly. If I just have it within one app, use dispatch, use selector. Check this out. So Now, if I want to dispatch to my provider, to my store, I need to say dispatch equals use dispatch here. So this gives the component, this component, the ability to dispatch. Selector. Now here, I'm just going to say state, return state. So gives component access to Redux state. So I think I might have a slightly incorrect syntax. Yeah, so I don't think I can have, or I need to have, well, curly braces there. Okay. So some things have slightly changed. So now I'm using provider to basically say that, okay, I'm using provider, I'm wrapping the whole React app with provider, and I'm giving the store there. What I'm also doing here, so that's this store that I've initialized. What I'm also doing is I'm giving this particular component access to dispatch, sending things to the store's reducer, and selector, grabbing the state from that store. Okay. Also, here, notice that I'm importing the reducer from a different file, and I'm saying that, okay, I'm creating the store with that reducer here. So here I create the store. Now, what I can actually do is I can remove this here, and I can move this down here. So it's striked off because nowadays we use Redux Toolkit. We don't just use the plain old Redux store, create store. So I think it's marked as deprecated just because of that, but it still works. Yeah. So when we use components with Redux, like many components, then we actually want to switch to using provider, selector, dispatch. The way I had it before, it only worked without that because everything was in one file. And you can see because notice that I was doing store.dispatch and store.getState. So I had to have access to the store in that place. And I could only do that without using React State if everything was in one file. Now I'm setting up the groundwork for having multiple components. And that's why I've changed to using provider and dispatch here to give the component the ability to dispatch, and selector and give component the ability to Redux state. So right now my app kind of looks like this. This is my app. This is the Redux store. And I'm setting up dispatch like that, and I'm getting the selector. This is the selector to grab the state, and dispatch is to send actions. So this is the current setup. Whereas before, everything was just in one file. And technically, yes, the store was separate, but to do the get state and store dot dispatch, because notice I was doing store dot get state dot dispatch, I had to have access to the store variable in that component. But notice here, so here I can't do store dot, well, technically I can because it's in the same file, but when I separate this out into more components, because I will be taking this out and that out, then I can't do that, which I will do shortly. But first, we want to make it work in this particular format we have. We want to make it work in this particular way, just to make that process easier to having many components, right? So does anyone have any questions so far about anything we've done or why I'm doing this? Okay, So let's finish implementing this. Right, so now we want to implement this part. So here what we would do is we would just do dispatch the action. Now this action, I'm importing it from a different place. Why did I move the note variable from? So it wasn't the note variable, it was the action to create it, right? So the reason why I moved it to another file was because when our applications get more complex, like we have many components, we cannot rewrite every action in the component. We need to have all our actions in one place that we can import from. And so that's why my reducer is in its own file, and these notes, or sorry, these actions that get dispatched to the reducer are also in that file. Just so when I start making more components, if I want to create a note in that component, I can just import it from that file. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm importing create note and toggle importance of from this file. Yes, typically our actions will go with the reducer in this format. Now, I think later today, Redux toolkit will be covered, and I believe it might be similar. It might be different, but it will be introduced a different way. But this is like our segue into Redux toolkit. So let's create note. And notice here in my implementation, my create note function, this create note action, well, it is a function. I take in a note and I return. Notice I'm just returning an object. I'm returning the action that I want to dispatch. That's why I can do this. Because really what's happening, this is just returning this action, very similar to what we had before. And at the end of the day, this is what's getting dispatched for. So we have that. I can save that. And then also, we should also do this one here. And this was dispatch toggle importance of, and I would just pass in the ID like that. That is also returning this action typeset importance payload. It's just that as well. Okay, so now let's test this. Oh, before we test it, we need to modify this. And so what we're going to do, this is going to be, I'm going to change this to notes because it is our notes. And this is just going to be notes.map. There we go. So that is, our refactoring is partway done. Let's just test that these dispatches are working. So that works. And yep, I can toggle all of these. That's good. And let me actually remove this console log just so it doesn't crowd out. Let's make a commit here. I'm going to say commit. We are partway through our refactoring. So now notice how this is different. I'm using this built-in dispatch from React Redux. I've used a provider to wrap around my app, which I pass a store into. And I'm also using these actions, create note and toggle importance. So these actions, I move them inside of my reducer, the file where I have my reducer. Exactly. Selector is to call the state. The dispatch is not to call the reducer, but dispatch is more, it's like, it gives us the ability to send an action to the reducer. So that's what we're doing here. We're sending these actions. Create note again. This was a function. I guess you could call it an action creator because it's a function that creates the action, the object, and then we send that. So this function just returns an object. This function just returns an object, but those are the objects we dispatch to get the change done. Definitely, yeah, you can have, you could do this. You can have node actions.js like that, and you can have them separately. And you know what? That actually might be better. I'm going to do that as well. actually do that. I like that idea. So some things are going to break, but that's okay. No. How did I do it here? Yeah, I just did that. So here, if I do that, now I can say export default note reducer. And yeah, so there's some errors there. Move that. And yeah, so I like that. I like that idea. So I'm also going to do that. And yeah, that should, everything still works basically. Because all these are doing is just they take in something, they return an object. I like that idea. It's good to sort of separate them like that, just so it's clear. Let's add that. So I'll just say separated actions from the reducer. Do that. Okay. Right. So now let's actually do the task of making new components. So the first thing I'm going to do, components, I'm going to move this form into a separate component. So let's say, let's call it, it's just thinking of a good name. Let's call it new note. So toggle importance of is a function in the note actions that's being called. Takes in an ID and it returns an object. It's an action creator, basically. It creates our action for us that we want to dispatch. So it returns an object with these two key value pairs, set importance, and payload. Payload is an object from the ID we pass in. And so here, when we call it in this particular place, that's what we have. All right. So actually, the first thing I do want to do is in components. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a, basically I want to create the form as a separate component. So we're going to call that new note. And let's think. So it's probably going to look like this. Let's move this down. And yeah, I'm just copying this basically. Let's see. So what do we do here? I'm going to be returning that. Now, one thing is if I'm returning this, I need to have these handlers. So I probably need to have this guy here. Now, if I have that there, notice that I'm using dispatch. So I probably need dispatch as well. So I'm going to import dispatch from React Redux. Then here I do need to say dispatch you. Sorry, this should be, I think that should be use dispatch. Right, so I could use props, but let's do it in the pure Redux way with no props, just to show, because maybe in your, so not for this project, not for your React project, but for future projects, if you want to use Redux, you can use Redux basically to eliminate these sort of having to send all these props. So we're going to do without any props. We're not going to send any props. Yeah. All right. So, and then here, export default. Is there anything else I'm missing that I might need in my notes? My note creation. function. Oh, I have that function, and I also have the dispatch, so it can do that. Oh, yes, you're right. My create note. Okay. Create note. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so it looks like everything's there. So actually now what I can do is here, I can just do this. And that's working. So I can actually remove all of the things that I'm not using anymore. And so that's good. So now notice that my new note here, it's basically a separate component. That's why I need to import this dispatch again. Exactly. Yeah. Or index.js. So yeah. So ideally, maybe later on, I will make a new app component, and I'll. But so far, so that's what we have so far. And let's say here we have refactored the form. So creating the form, we've moved that to a separate component, okay? That's good. Now let's refactor the notes. All this. So there's a lot there. So actually what I'm going to do, let's just say, oops, not a file folder. We want a file. We're going to say notes.js. And we're going to use the same sort of thing. We're going to say note. Actually, so I'm setting up the format to have an individual note. Because remember, our notes here, we're going to be also having some logic to handle showing an individual note. So it'll be a bit clearer. So let's actually remove that for now. Let's just have our notes. We'll do that step in the step process. So let's move this all down there. Actually, I want this to be inside of here. So can I actually, no, I need to, yeah, whole thing needs to be in a fragment. Oops. That. So now we don't have the extra one. Okay. And yeah, everything's still working. Okay. So one thing we're going to change, we're going to move these two to here. And it's probably going to give me an error. Yeah. Just say wrap in a fragment. So the reason why I have to wrap it is because I can only have like one thing being returned. So it has to be, I can't return that and this. It has to be like inside of another thing. So I just put an empty fragment there to do that for me. Okay. Okay, let's do that. For now, let's just leave it like that. Indentations quite large. Okay. So what do I need to make the notes work? It looks like I need to actually have a selector. So we're going to copy this. We're going to move this into here. So that actually, so now we have access to that. I need to also import the selector. And what else do I need? Looks like that might be good. Handle click. Yeah, exactly. Okay, perfect. Right. So we need our handlers. So we need, oops, we need this guy here. let's move that to here. Right, and then because we have that, we also need to import, I'll go with importance of. We'll get that, exactly. Perfect, okay. Let's try this now. Let's try. Will it still work? Dispatch is not defined. Okay, so, oh, right, because I removed, oh no. Oh, yes, here. So I need to have use dispatch. And I need to say here, dispatch equals use dispatch. And that should hopefully work. Okay, perfect. So now we have, basically, we have almost finished this process. And I don't need dispatch here, I think, either. I don't need that. And now notice how much simpler our function, like our app, our main component becomes. Exactly. So we just have those two things there. And we're not even using state. We're not, we're not saying use states or like props or anything like that. Yeah. Oh, but there are more things we can do. So now this kind of looks messy. So let's do a few things. We have notes. What if we just have a note? So actually, before we make that change, I do want to commit. So commit often. That's the tip here. So we have refactored notes. We're going to create a note component for like an individual note. Let's do that here. So let's say note. And then note is an individual note. And I would think that this should actually be in here. So I'm going to move that there. My dispatch is also going to be here. Because I want my logic, I basically want an individual note here. So this is actually where we actually would need a prop. Because we do want access to the content of the note. So what we're going to do is I'm going to copy this here. And that's what we're going to have there. Is there any way to that? Perfect. Now, I'm just taking an individual note out. And so now what's going to happen is I'm going to use this here. So I'm going to be returning each child in the list should have a unique key. Okay. I think I will remove this key from the list item. I'm actually going to put it in this component because these components also have keys, like the React component and then this HTML element, but only having it here is not really working. So yeah, they need it at this level. So I'm actually just going to remove it there and put it in this one, because at the end of the day, the individual note just has one list item. So if I have one at the level of the components, it should be fine. And that should get rid of that. Yeah, message. Okay. Now this function also doesn't need to be here, which means we also don't need our dispatch. And yeah, instead, and save. And let's see, important, that all works. That works. Awesome. Okay, so everything works so far. So it seems to me like we have finished our refactoring. We have completed refactoring. Anyone have any questions so far about the refactoring? Because we're going to do one more thing that is an extension on what we've learned before. index. Exactly, yeah. So I could have a separate file, absolutely, but I just put the note in the same file, but I'm only exporting notes, plural. Notice that, so this is an individual note. And that's what I return here. And so this is my map that goes over all my notes. It's changing the object to the React component, and then this is actually what gets rendered. But I have one default export from this file, which is the plural notes. So when I import here, it's no issue. I'm just saying import notes. Because in my notes, there I handle an individual note here, which is I'm referencing there. Okay. So there's one thing we're going to add, and I think it would be interesting if we had a filter. So what if we had like a radio button that could, when clicked, so let's say we had the following. So let's say we have a radio button and we have kind of like, we have all important and then not important. And if I click important, I only want it to show these two. If I click not important, I only want it to show this one. I don't want it to show those. So we're going to implement that. So I'm not sure if it's, so I see another question here. Like, does this have an effect on two components or files or one component and speed of execution on server? So right now, all of this is local. I'm not sure if there's any change on the server in terms of like how fast something like the React DOM might be returned that we want to get. But yeah, I'm not sure. I just put them in one file just because it was a bit easier to do that. It might, I'm thinking 2 files might take more space. So that could be one thing. But yeah. So, okay, so let's implement. So, okay, one thing, the reason why I'm even implementing this is because I want to make the state a bit more complicated. Right now, our state just looks like this. We just have notes and then the array. I want to change our state to this, an object, which has an array of notes, each note being an object, right? Like these are objects inside. And I want to add a new thing to my state. In particular, I want to add a string called filter. So remember how in our notes app and in other previous applications, we would keep track of some search term or something and use that to filter what the user sees. We're doing the same thing here, but instead of using state in React, we're going to make our Redux state a bit more complicated here, and we're going to add a new basically key value pair in our state, and we're going to call it filter. And that's going to change a few things. So the first thing we should do is let's just make the reducer, and I will explain how this comes together. So we're just going to first do our filter reducer, and this is going to keep track of the filter reducer is how we actually change that state, that like one word. So I'm just going to call it filter reducer, and I'm going to say the starting state is all, and then I take an action in. Okay. Now this will become more clear, like why it's like that very shortly. So I'm going to switch. Actually, not type, and I'm just going to say that I just need one case setting the filter, and I'm going to return action.payload. So the idea is, maybe I can, right. So the idea here is that when I click all, I want to, the action I send to the state, I just want it to have, I want it to only have the payload, which is what the new value should be. So if I click this radio button, it should be all the payload. If I click this one, it should be important. If I click this one here, it should be not important. So that's all this is doing, really. It's just changing this state. And then the default case, which we would never enter, but that's just part of the switch case syntax, is that. And let's just export this for later. Here, let's make another one, filter actions. And again, this is just going to be handling the actions. So we're just going to have a single action, going to be filtered, changing the filter. We receive the new value and we return the action object. So type set filter, payload filter. Oops. I noticed that the reason why I'm setting that, and then the payload is just what I pass in. Okay, so, but we're going to see more of that there. Okay, so we have these two set. Oh yeah, let me add a console log here with the action so we can see what happens when we click that. Okay, so here's the thing. Right now, what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to add, for now, I'm just going to add it here. Okay, maybe to make this a bit more straightforward. Yeah, let's just put it here, bottom. Okay, so we're going to be using a radio button. So let's put it inside a div. Input type radio. And let's just do that. Important. Non-important. Okay. So now we see these three radio buttons. Okay. Now here, I'm going to say, I don't think I need a name. I think I just need an on change. Let's just see, just put handle clicked radio, or handle clicked button. Sure, let's just call it that. So I'm going to get my event and I'm going to get my actual, I don't need that. I just need the value. So, clicked. You know, this is partially for testing. That's why I'm putting this here. Now let's put our on change here. So that we can, when someone clicks any of these, we basically have that. Now, I need to write it this way. So I need to write it like this because my on change here just has one sort of parameter, which is the event itself. Now, I actually don't want to pass the event. I want to instead, well, I could do that. I could, yeah, let's actually try that. What happens if I do this? What if I make this E? Oops. What if I do this? Interesting. Okay. Because this is more similar to, doing it this way is more similar to how we've done it before. So I'm just going to try this. non-important. If we did name, I think name, yes, I think we could do that as well, because then we would do, actually, no. So if we did name, because the event is already being called, it's already being attached to a particular input, we don't need to do name to distinguish one from another. Because if I click this one, I know that this on change is actually going to be called like this event, the event attached to this one. The name is more helpful when I have multiple fields inside of a form, because the form, that on submit function, ran when any of those were clicked. So then we needed name to distinguish between them. In this case, it's running on a per element basis. Yeah. So let's test this. I have that. If I click that, clicked all, clicked important, click not. Ooh, okay. I see the issue. When I click these, it stays clicked. It doesn't unselect the other ones. So that is an issue. And I think that is why we don't want to use this value here we don't want to get it that way. So what we actually want to do, because the typical format is when I click this, and then, so if I save that, if I click this, the default, it should be unclicking. What's going on here? Do I need to name it? Oh yeah, I think, okay. So I think I actually need to attach, yeah. So we need a name on our radio buttons. Yeah. There we go. So I think I can use, well, I could use value, but maybe just to save. Sure, let's and let's put the same name on all of them. So without the name, I think it was treating them as separate, and that's actually why they didn't deselect the other ones. Try that. Awesome. And notice that I'm passing in the value that I want to change. And that's what I'm console logging out here. All right, so let's refresh that. Okay, good. So I know at this point, it's doing what I want. Now, here's the thing. In our here, we just have a store with one reducer. But here's the issue. So let's actually commit frequently and commit often. So here we added radio button and a simple handler. Here's the thing. So there's one thing that changes here. And this is a really good segue to next lecture, which is going to be covering, our next lecture is going to be covering Redux Toolkit. So this is basically our segue into Redux Toolkit. One thing is changing now. Because our state is more complicated, we have two things in it. We don't just have notes. Now we have two reducers. And that's typically a better way to handle it, where each separate, I'm going to use a term, slice of state has its own reducer. And we're going to see this term slice again when the Redux Toolkit is covered. So if I want to change this, there's one more thing I need to do. I need to update something called combine reducers. Now, what is this going to do? Let's actually clear this guy there so that's not distracting. So what combine reducers will do is I need to create a new reducer. Create a new reducer for our store, which combines both the reducers we have. So let's actually import note reducer. Let's import filter reducer. That imports all right. Okay. Here's how we create the new reducer. We would just say reducer equal combine reducer. Now, and then, so this is, I was actually, when I was reviewing for this, I actually was getting an error over and over again. And the the cause of that error was actually not thinking in terms of the proper state. So when I do this here, I'm basically saying, I want my state to look like this. I want my state to have a field notes that is handled by the note reducer. I want my state to have a field filter that is handled by the filter reducer. Okay. So what the state will actually end up looking like. Yeah. So the reason why this is happening is because I've changed my state from just being this. It's basically just that, or rather, it's not even like notes. It's literally just, my state is literally just an array of objects, right? Because it's an array of objects, I can do this. Notice that here I'm just returning state, and I say notes equals that. This could just be state. It doesn't really need to be notes. This is just a variable holding the state. And then I just do .map, right? Because the state itself is an array. So now when I make that change in my reducer here, when I combine these two, I'm changing the state to look like this. I'm changing it to an object. And I'm saying that I'm going to have two key value pairs in this object. Now, my notes key, the value associated with that, I'm going to get from my note reducer. And so what that is this. When I only had one reducer, my state was just an array. Now my state is an object with two key value pairs. And again, when I say notes and note reducer, I'm just saying that in my state, which is now an object, the key notes is going to be attached to the notes reducer, and it's going to get its state from that. So this is actually going to be this array. This is this array. And what about my filter? Well, I grab that from my filter reducer. So this, let's just do that in red. This is going to come from this. It's actually going to be a string in the beginning, all. Okay. So that's how that works. Does anyone have any questions about how that has changed? Sorry, I know the arrows are a bit confusing because I'm on a different file. Okay, so that is how that has changed. One more thing. Right, so now it looks, our state is an object, and actually, I can even console log my store here. So why don't I console log? Right, so I won't do it there. I'm going to do it here, right? Because this is going to break. So we actually need to, in our notes here, we're going to return state.notes, and that should fix that issue. Yeah. Using each state has its own dispatch, including type and payroll. So the state doesn't have its own dispatch. The reducer has its. We use. I guess the best way to think of it is that you can literally think of the state now as looking like this. So we have in our state, we now have two key value pairs. And remember before when I just had my note reducer, I was always getting my state from this. So my state was just an array. But now with the change that I've made, I have my state is going to be an object when I use this combined reducers. And the notes is one slice of that state. My state now has two things in it, not just one. My state now has it's an object with two key value pairs. This slice is going to be notes, and I'm going to get the state of that, like that portion of the state, that store, that slice of the store is going to come from the note reducer. It's basically going to be this array. This slice with filter is going to come from my filter reducer, and that's just going to be this. It's going to be a string. Now, I could have just put a new case here, and I could have put the state, like I could have just had one reducer, but this is a segue into Redux Toolkit, because Redux Toolkit by default has slices of state, and reducers handle these slices. Exactly. Each slice of state has a reducer. So now we've seen how we went from just having a state with one thing in it, just an array. And then we had the same state. We were using dispatch provider for more complicated apps, right? Multiple components. And now we're showing, yes, we're still using the dispatch and all that, but now we're showing combining reducers. So now we have more complex state or store. For sure. So I will re-explain the filter, and then we'll actually implement the filter. So what this filter is so what I have changed is I've made my state more complex, right? So is it clear that before what I had was just an array? My state was just an array. Right? So so it was just an array before. That was my state. And we know that because before in my code, if I get rid of this, if I just return this state, which this was working before, now it breaks. It says notes.map is not a function. And the reason it's breaking is because this right here, when I combine reducers, I'm basically defining my new store. I'm going to use store instead of state, because I think store is a better word. It's a Redux store. That's where I store my state. So when I do this format, I'm basically saying, okay, I want to make my state an object. And I'm going to have two key value pairs in it, notes and filter. So all of this together is my state or store. I'm going to use that interchangeably. But each of these is a slice of that, okay? This note reducer handles the note slice. Filter reducer handles the filter slice. These handle slices of that. And yeah, so very shortly I will console log it, but so this thing here, what goes here, what is that slice? It gets it from the note reducer. And the note reducer, remember, it was just an array. So this is like this now is inside of that in my state, in my store. And then my filter reducer tells me what needs to go in there. And this is just a string, all. So when I click that radio button, the idea is that this just changes. Okay. So I hope that clarified that. And I do think to clarify it even more, we're going to add a console log here. So here, I will return state.notes, but I'm actually going to console log our state. Our state is state. And let's see what this looks like. Check that out. So here, okay. This is just saying the state is a string for the filter reducer. This might make it more clear. So here, this is our new store, or our new state is just an object. And this is actually what I'm just saying console log state, because here the notes, I have to do state.notes. And notice here, this is an object. So I have a filter, which is set to all, and I have notes, which is my notes. And filter is all because by default, I want to show all the, I haven't implemented filter yet, but by default, I want to show all my notes. And that's why I just have that set to all. So there's one thing I need to implement here. This function, if I do this, so I will need to import dispatch. Use dispatch. So I can actually update the state. Whoops. Check this out. So if I do this and I say, right, I need a filter action. So what was that set? What was my filter action? Filter change. Okay. Filter change. Okay. If I do this, and this is, let's just make this selection selected. Let's just, it's a good name for this radio selection. I get that value. I'm going to dispatch that. Okay. So now, so action type decided which reducer I'm using to modify the slice of state. So actually, that's a great question. I believe that this React Redux internally handles which reducer we're using. Yeah, because all I'm sending dispatch is just an action, like like I'm just sending it. I'm literally just sending it this. So that's a great question. Like, how does it know that this is actually in the filter and not in the notes? And it actually, there's nothing that I'm telling it to do that. I think it internally has a lot of handling that can sort of say that, okay, don't actually go into this, actually go into this. So that's a great question. And I believe that is handled internally to know which reducer to like go into. Yeah. So right now by default, I have all. If I click important, notice here that set filter important. So that is this console log here. And then our state is now filter important. So there's that. So now we have state is being updated by, yeah, we are way over time, but I do think we'll just finish this because we're almost done. State being updated by the filter action. Now, one interesting thing is that we are still re-rendering our notes, even though we technically don't want to. I was under the impression that this would actually prevent, according to ChatGPT, that would actually prevent the component will only render if the data property in some slice of the Redux state changes. Yeah, so this should not be re-rendering because nothing, well, yeah, like the state.notes does not change, but I think that is something to look into later. Let's implement this filter. So what we're going to do is So our filter is actually going to happen at this level. So I think this is good. And so we have notes, and let's grab our filter. It is going to be use selector state dot filter. And this can also just be, I don't need to have this fancy. It's going to be here. Let's check, does that work? Yeah, doesn't look like anything breaks. Okay, so now let's actually implement this filter. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have handle filter function, and this is actually the function that I'm gonna call here. I'm gonna say dot filter handle filter. Now this dot filter, sorry, let's read what it says. A function that accepts up to 3 arguments. The filter method calls the predicate function, so I can actually pass a function into this. That's the idea of callback. One time for each element in the array. Returns the elements of an array that meet the conditions specified in a callback function. So this dot filter returns a new array, and then my dot map will map over that. And the idea with a filter is as follows. So our filter either returns true or false. If it returns true, that item, basically whatever we have there, is going to be inside of the new array, or note in this case. If it returns false, it will not be. So let's think more about that. So here I have access to my note because our filter by default, if I pass in handle filter here, or really anything, the first value for any function I get access to, the first argument is just the value itself. So in this case, that would be the note. So I can actually do that. I can put note there. Also, when I write this syntax here, it's like I'm defining a new function. It's just there's no name. It's something called an anonymous function. And notice that's here. In that anonymous function, I get access to up to 3 arguments. The value, the index, and I actually get access to the array that I'm iterating over, but it's read only, so I can't actually modify it. I can only read it. The first one is the only one we need. We only need the note. But we're going to say, okay, so this is pretty important. We're going to say if filter is all, just return the note. Because if everything is allowed, then don't do any filter, basically. Else, if the filter is important, return note.important. So what this means is, if note.important is true, this will return true. If note.important is false, it will return false. And then the last case, because we only have 3 cases, the last case is not important. So I'm going to return not note.important. What that means is that if this note.important is false, so if it's not important, I'm going to not that. I'm going to like negate it to make it true. So this will be true if the node is not important, and false if the node is important. Okay, so we're going to do that. And let's try that out now. So I am filtering with handle filter before I map it. And let's just double check here. Here I am properly dispatching. Yep, and we know that I was dispatching, so hopefully this should work. So if I click all, nothing changes. If I click important, I should not see this mango note. Perfect. And if I click non-important, I should only see the mango note. Perfect. Okay, so we know it's working. And this pineapple one by default was important, so we should not see it. And then if I click only important, we'll see it again. So let's just make some more changes. All, show everything, show that, show that. Okay, perfect. So that is it for today. And yeah, I hope that solidified some concepts. Now, this is in the, so if you This is actually in the like our own repo. So if you can make a fork of our repo and you can sync changes and you'll get access to these. I'm just gonna do one more thing. I'm actually gonna off screen. I'm going to refactor the filter just so that's in a separate. It's going to be in a separate component, and then I will push everything to main. And I'll let everybody know here when I have made that push to main, so you can sync changes. But yeah, that's about it for the lecture. Maybe we can take. Sorry, that did go over time, but I think there were quite a few things that we had to go over, and I think things like map, filter, for each, these callback functions, these array methods, we're going to go over that on. Hopefully on Friday, we'll have another lecture just to go over those, but also if anybody has any other like things that you might want us to go over in terms of these concepts, do let us know, and we can also cover that because Friday is sort of like, hopefully will be an open lecture, so we can do that.